We've got our senior counsel for global affairs, former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, joining us now because over the weekend, if you're watching the broadcast you saw during the break, but I do want to play it for everybody who is listening to the broadcast. You heard President Biden make a pretty big admission in a CNN interview, not necessarily intentionally, but about U.S. ammunition stockpiles because of what we've sent to Ukraine and just kind of where they are in the world. I'll actually just let you listen to what President Biden had to say.
This is a war relating to munitions and the running out of that ammunition, and we're low on it. And so what I finally did, took the recommendation of the Defense Department to not permanently, but to allow for in this transition period where we get more 155 weapons, these shells for the Ukrainians.
Right to you, Secretary Pompeo. Is it concerning that the president's showcasing to the world how depleted our military is right now?
Well, Jordan, it most certainly is. This looks like something that wasn't scripted. And sadly, President Biden often, when he's unscripted, says things that are either inaccurate or unhelpful. In this case, I think it's probably a little bit of both. It's certainly unhelpful. I think that's what you're getting to. We should never acknowledge broadly to our adversaries that we've got a weakness or a shortcoming. We should project strength. This is how you deter, right? Remember, we get into this mess because President Biden says that a minor incursion into Ukraine might be okay. It seems like a long time ago, but weakness is provocative. And I think Vladimir Putin, hearing our president say, gosh, we don't have unlimited amounts of inventory to provide to the Ukrainians, will cause him to be even more determined and more resolved to continue to attack. Second, as for what the actual numbers are, where we are, I've seen different descriptions of that. Obviously, I'm not in government, so I don't have a good handle on this today. But two things I think are both true. One, it's certainly true that we have provided a lot of munitions to the Ukrainians. Those would have been munitions available for others, maybe not even in every case for us. They might have been older weapon systems, older munitions. But second, the more strategic problem is we have a long-running gap in our capacity, our industrial capacity to provide for sustained conflict. And if this conflict in Ukraine, where we have provided relatively limited resources to them in a relatively small space, we are vastly unprepared to counter the even larger threat from the Chinese Communist Party. So if President Biden is even close, even remotely right about a shortcoming, we need to make sure that we put our industrial base in place sufficiently so that if there is a scaled conflict that involves Americans directly, that our soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines have the tools and the ammunition they need to protect themselves.
I think that's very important for people to know, Secretary Pompeo. What you just said there is that if what has been, again, this scale in Ukraine is depleting our ammunitions, and we were already on a path where we just don't have the industrial capacity. Is that something they can turn on if they want to? Can he order this? And I mean, I think this is the kind of spending that Americans don't mind, which is spending on our national security. Can it be turned on like a switch? Do we have that capability?
No, sadly, it's not. It's not just a flick of a switch. This has lead times. You have to get the raw materials. It's worth noting that the Chinese Communist Party is in possession of some of the materials we need for some of our more high-end systems. So again, much like we saw during COVID, we've allowed our supply chain to just get all out of balance, and we've put ourselves at risk. It is not a flip of a switch. It takes time. It takes determination. It takes focus. And to the extent that we have a shortfall, this is a failure of the Biden administration to work a year, 2 years, 3 years ago to begin to replace it. I don't want to make this political. We need to make sure we get this right over the long run. Every mother and father who have a child who has signed up to defend America in uniform needs to be sure that we've done the right thing by their kids and make sure that they've got what they need if there is, in fact, a big conflict that involves them.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly right. I think that's something that it doesn't have to be political at all, that every American's like, this is why we pay our taxes. This is why we want to make sure we've got these defenses. It's number one reason is so that we've got what the military needs to defend us and to also defend themselves if there is a conflict. I want to go to the cluster bombs issue because there's just a lot of confusion about it. I mean, I think that people are, on the one hand, know that the United States, we don't sign a lot of these treaties restricting certain weapons, but we also know that the United States military has a kind of a different level of respect even on the battlefield for how we utilize certain weapons. There are people nervous now that if we give cluster bombs over to a military that we're not entirely control over, that it could escalate and cause the Russians to utilize weapons, which again may be more lethal even on the battlefield. Do you think I think some of this explanation for why we went to the cluster bombs is because we were running low on the other ammunitions.
Well, it's so unclear. And this is the darndest thing about the Biden administration with respect to providing this support that I believe is deeply important for America. President Biden hasn't explained it, right? He hasn't explained to the American people, this is why we're doing what we're doing. This is how it matters. If you're in Arizona or you're in Michigan and you're trying to feed your family and take care of your kids and get them to school, make sure they're learning the right things, President Biden owes it to the American people to explain every element of the use of taxpayer resources to support the defense of Ukraine from Vladimir Putin. The munitions issue is no different from that. You know, I'm familiar with this particular weapon system that I think it is that they're going to provide now. You should know that the Russians have already been using a very similar system. That doesn't mean it's right for us to do it, but make no mistake, I think the chance that this is escalatory is probably pretty low. If Vladimir Putin intends to escalate, he will do it whether we use a particular weapon system or not. His tolerance for infliction of civilian destruction and wanton violence is pretty unconnected to what it is the United States is providing. So I don't think this will escalate. I do think there's a closer question about, do we have the controls in place to make sure these weapons get used in the right way by friendlies and don't end up in the hands of people that we wouldn't want them to end up? That is a legitimate concern. I pray that the Biden administration has done all of that homework before they actually deliver those weapon systems.
Right. I mean, because it's just, again, I think you're right. It's not like we're dealing with a rational actor with Putin. So you can't say, oh, because of A, B is going to happen. And suddenly, and I think it's important that you point out too, because I don't think most people knew that these weapon systems, basically similar weapon systems, are already being utilized by the Russians against Ukraine. I think that people they're just nervous because the whole thing seems to be spinning a little bit out of control with what's happened in the last couple of weeks in Russia, what's happening inside there domestically and their issues, and just kind of not hearing a clear plan, kind of just getting piecemeal issues from the Biden administration time and time again. I want to switch to a domestic issue because you wrote about it. It's a new piece up at aclj.org. So again, you can find this there. It's exclusive at our website from Secretary Pompeo. It's protecting free speech is fundamental to preserving America. And so we've talked about these international threats, but one threat domestically we're seeing time and time again is this administration specifically, and we just got uncovered by a federal court case, is just their focus on restricting Americans' ability to speak and criticize the government.
It's stunning, these revelations. Jordan, I think we all had a sense that this was taking place. We'd seen some of the stuff that came out of the Twitter files over the last months. We'd seen it, but now we saw naked. We saw actual names of actual people making actual phone calls and actual demands on a private company to take down information that was simply at odds with the government's position, with things that are certainly debatable and now in many cases actually seem to have been right. But whether they turned out to have been right or not isn't really the point, Jordan. To the extent you have government officials essentially demanding that private companies censor speech, we're headed to a place, and I think people in every political perspective can see this, we're headed to a place that America has not been, where now we are using governmental power through a private proxy to try and do what the government clearly cannot do, deny us our basic freedom to speak and to debate and to discuss. I bet there's more there, Jordan. I haven't seen it. I can't prove it, but I'm guessing this is tip of the iceberg. And President Biden ought to call out those staff people on his own team who did that and say, that's not right. You shouldn't have done this, or he should admit this was done in his own direction. Either way, this is a problem for the administration because it presents an enormous challenge to the First Amendment and the American people.
You know, they're fighting out in court. They're appealing that decision that they want to be able to tell those social media companies, not about like real threats from terrorism or real threats of maybe drug cartels and bad actors. Everybody would get that. That would be the correct way to go to a social media company or any company and say, hey, your product's being utilized by these bad actors. But to target Americans because, hey, we don't like their speech. We don't like their viewpoint on this issue or that issue. And again, like you said, some of this stuff has been proved true, but that's not what the First Amendment's not about, true or false. It's about opinions. Secretary Pompeo, we appreciate you joining us and weighing in on all these very important issues.